Welcome to another Town Hall Thursdays. I'm your host, Darryl W. Perry, Libertarian for Governor, and I'm joined this week by Justin O'Donnell, the Libertarian for U.S. Senate in New Hampshire. Justin, thank you for joining me.
Oh, thank you for having me, Darryl.
So, first off, I'm not sure if you've watched any of the town halls. The way I like to do this when I have guests is it's much more of a conversation than like an interview, question and answer sort of thing. But obviously, we will answer audience questions. So if anybody is watching on the Facebook Live, you can jump into the Zoom over at darrylwperry.com/Zoom, and I will monitor the chat there. Normally, my wife monitors the Facebook comments for questions, but she's busy doing things for the Joe Jorgensen for President campaign, and she's not able to help us out tonight. So if you have the questions, again, darrylwperry.com/Zoom. So, Justin, there's actually a couple of things that before we sort of get into discussing, all sorts of political stuff as far as, like what you're campaigning on, what I'm campaigning on, how COVID has sort of derailed everything. There's some huge news. And of course, I broke the 35% reduction in petitions last week. And then yesterday, the Libertarian Party of New Hampshire, you and about half a dozen other volunteers drove around the state dropping off petitions. And late Tuesday, the governor, by and through his attorney, along with the Secretary of State, by and through his attorney, who's the same attorney, they have assented to the temporary restraining order that was, again, the 35% reduction in petitions. They have assented to that, and they are the ones that requested that the court make that the final order. And I'm pleasantly surprised that they did that, because they didn't need to file anything, and they could have just kept us worrying until August 11th if they were going to appeal.
No, I think it's the Secretary of State's office maybe exerting what little influence they actually do have over the governor. Because throughout all of this, Gilletta had always said during her dealings with the Secretary of State's office, they'd been incredibly fair and come around, and they didn't really want to deal with the petitioning during a pandemic either. But even then, like historically, Deputy Secretary Scanlan's always been very friendly to us. He treated us fairly within the scope of his job, at least. Even when going to testify at the Ballot Law Commission or the House Committee on Ballot Acts on election law, even when we were on opposing sides of issues, he was always very respectful and very friendly, and recognized that we had a seat at the table.
Which cannot be said for very many people in Concord.
No, it can't, unfortunately. It can't even be said for many very people in that election law committee room.
Right.
So it's always been nice to have at least Deputy Secretary Scanlan recognizing that we deserve to be treated as equals at the table and within the bounds of what he's able to do within the scope of his job, treating us fairly.
Yeah, and of course, WMUR put out an article today about our petition turn-in, and one thing that I did not see was whether or not Green Party presidential candidate Howie Hawkins turned in any petitions in New Hampshire.
I don't believe Howie did, and it's been very disappointing to me. As in 2016, I did not just help the Libertarian Party get on the ballot. 2016 was a totally different year. I helped Libertarian, Green, Constitution. The ballot access is something that's really important to me on a fundamental principle level. I've helped a communist get on the ballot in Massachusetts before because they deserve to have their voice heard. And hey, they might have a better chance than me in Massachusetts. But it was disappointing to see. I don't think Howie petitioned anywhere this year. I saw a few posts about a few different states they were trying, but I think the Green Party kind of recognized the pandemic for what it was and took the ballot access they had.
Also, in recognizing the pandemic for what it was, and this is something that I pointed out, and this is going a little inside baseball, so I won't stay there too long. But I even pointed out to the LNC, the then LNC, back in April and May, and even in June into early July, as well as the Convention Oversight Committee, that the Greens had recognized in late April that they were not going to be able to have an in-person convention the same weekend that we had that hybrid convention in July.
Yeah, it's again inside baseball. As someone who was on the LNC at that time, I think most of us were well aware of it too. It was just a lot of pressure and people not wanting to be wrong.
A couple of people on the Convention Oversight Committee that wanted to basically flip a middle finger to COVID for reasons.
Yeah, they really wanted the Libertarian Party to have the ability to say COVID was over. And that's just not the case. But what it boiled down to ending up happening is, if you really break it down, is the two major parties, the Republicans, the Democrats, the other two national parties, I call them, the Green Party and the Libertarian Party, for the four national parties, because I mean the Constitution Party is only a ballot access in 10, 12 states, and then there's a couple. The Party for Socialism and Liberation is California only, the Working Families Party is New York only, and stuff like that. But of the four national parties, the Libertarian Party is the only one that had an in-person convention.
Right.
Even the Republicans canceled theirs.
They're now saying that the Republicans, not only are they going to, have like very few people in wherever it is that they have the people, but Donald Trump is giving his, sort of victory speech, nomination speech from the White House. I don't know if it's going to be from the Oval Office, but somewhere in the White House. Joe Biden is not actually going to wherever the Democrats are having their thing.
Well, let's be honest, both Joe Biden and Donald Trump are very high risk for dying from COVID, too. Yes. They're both in their late 70s and not in the greatest health.
Yeah. And at this point, I know that I saw something about Donald Trump wanting one of the presidential debates to be earlier than originally scheduled. But apparently Joe Biden there's talk about Joe Biden not participating in debate. So, will there even be CPD-sponsored presidential debates this year? Will there be debates for U.S. Senate or governor this year?
Well, I mean, when it comes, the first part of that question, will there be CPD-sponsored debates? Why does there have to be? That's really something we need to come around to. Why does there have to be CPD-sponsored debates? Why does this one organization get a monopoly on deciding what 300 million Americans get to hear when there are organizations that have historically done better jobs? Why can't the League of Women Voters have a debate? Why can't Ford Motor Companies have a debate? Why can't whoever wants to hold a debate have one?
Prior to the 1998 election, the League of Women Voters did host the presidential debates.
Right. Then they made the fatal mistake of inviting a third-party candidate.
That was in 1980. And Jimmy Carter refused to attend that debate. The debate that Anderson was not invited to, he did this sort of pseudo-live response thing, to where he started with a live stream of, the actual debate, using air quotes there. And then after Reagan and Carter gave their answers, he gave his, and then it went to a tape delay of the incoming questions and answers. And his thing was aired on C-SPAN. The other was aired on ABC, I believe. And I was actually talking with Dr. Jorgensen about this last week when she was on the town hall, and was saying, with the technology that we have now, we can do these things basically from our living room. We don't need the assistance of, the TV station in Manchester to let us use their thing and hope that they'll, connect their satellite to whatever feed we need.
Right, but even if we were to have the ability to do that, I mean, again, when we're in WMUR, the TV station in Manchester, at least acknowledges that they have to at least give us some acknowledgement, and lets us use their studio for stuff like that.
But
What's
you know,
stopping us? What's stopping Dr. Jorgensen from reaching out to C-SPAN to organize something like that? What stopped Gary Johnson from doing it in 2016 when we had that opportunity? And C-SPAN, is that really something they could say no to, even legally?
Legally, they could say you have to cover the cost.
Okay, what's the cost?
They can charge you.
Yeah.
The cost can vary. Like, you know, it depends on how many people do they need to operate cameras, how many people do they need running switchboards or, you know, mixers. So that's the thing I don't know the answer to, but having worked not worked for community access television, but being a former board member for a community access TV station, I do know that they can charge production. And I would say that for C-SPAN, they could get away with charging tens of thousands of dollars for the service. It's just a matter of, you know, if the candidate wanted to come up with the monies, and also whether the CPD would give them the broadcast rights to, you know, fill in their answers live. And that's probably where the bulk of the money would come from, is having to buy the broadcast rights.
See, I think that's something that's the fundamental issue. Now, I agree with the market and being able to dictate things and pricing in an open market, including with television broadcast. But at the root of it, broadcasting over open airwaves and the content that they are broadcasting is in the national interest, and it's in the interest of the people. Why is anyone allowed to retain the universal rights to the broadcast of a presidential debate?
The same way that people are allowed to retain the broadcast rights of any event that happens in public.
Right.
Well, you can't stream a Major League Baseball game without getting express written permission from Major League Baseball, even if you can see the ballpark from your apartment across the street in Chicago.
Right. But nobody's ever going to argue that the White Sox-Cubs game in Chicago at the end of the season is of national interest.
Right. And I don't believe the words national interest appear in copyright laws. But again, we're sort of, you know, getting out into the weeds a little bit. Let's sort of, you know, go back a little bit. And one of the reasons that I'm even doing these town halls is because of COVID.
Right.
Where all of the events that we had planned to attend this summer, even events that I had planned to attend this fall and had originally paid a reservation fee for a table at the Granite State Comic-Con, that has been canceled. Like, everything is canceled. So we can't go do retail politics in a safe manner that is also responsible. So decide, all right, you know what? Still want to do something. Let's do town halls. I've got nothing happening on Thursdays. Let's do it then and call it Town Hall Thursdays.
Right. Well, that's embracing the technology we have, and that's adapting to the new normal. And the way things are trending, there's no saying that we're going back to retail politics. There's no saying that we're going back to public events after this. The COVID-19 is a virus, whatever people want to say, until they come up with a flat-out vaccine for it along the style of polio. This is here to stay. It's not going anywhere. Even if we do develop herd immunity after a couple of years, you're still going to have your odd infection here and there, and it's still going to be a seasonal risk. So masks in public is going to be the new normal. It's been a normal in a large part of the world's population in China, Japan, and Korea since the SARS outbreak. This is just something that's going to trigger that kind of a change here, I believe.
Right.
So adapting to the technology and using what is at our fingertips. Again, me converting my own home studio into a digital studio to bring people in from other places for my own show was not an easy task, but I feel like it's something that needs to happen. But in the line of doing that, I'm now no longer limited to guests that can come to my home studio for my programs.
Right.
Now it expanded what we're able to do. And I think that's the key thing that people are missing in the COVID debate is, sure, it'd be great if the economy opened. It'd be great if everything got back to normal. But what's stopping us from reopening in different ways? What's stopping us from innovating and finding ways to adapt to the situation so that when it does all settle down, when the dust does settle, we're in a better position moving forward anyways?
Yeah. And I realize that we're running for completely different level offices, state and federal. There's not a whole lot of overlap as far as how we would approach certain issues.
Right.
But one thing that allegedly recently got passed through Congress was a reform of qualified immunity that some people were saying was an abolition. It wasn't. The Ending Qualified Immunity Act that was introduced by Justin Amash, the Libertarian in Congress, that language was not in the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act. There was some other language that, kind of tweaked the edges of qualified immunity a little bit as it applies to federal police, but otherwise it basically left qualified immunity alone. But there's a claim that, there are certain members of Congress that want to abolish all police and get rid of qualified immunity. I know that, you're running for U.S. Senate. If elected, would you be one of those members of Congress that actually wants to get rid of the police and eliminate qualified immunity?
At the very least, on a federal level. When it does break down to the states, again, you're running for governor. What's best for New Hampshire is not necessarily what's best for Colorado, which is not necessarily what's best for California. I see one of the biggest problems that we have with the federal government is the one-size-fits-all approach and the top-down governance from the federal government, telling people in rural Montana that they have to go through the same restrictions and safety guidelines as people in New Jersey. It doesn't make sense. But from a specific standpoint of policing powers, why does the Department of Education have a SWAT team? Why does, these are things you can look at the budget lines and realize that almost every federal agency has policing powers, and almost every federal agency has a police force. Some of them make sense. The U.S. Marshals actually have a constitutional role to answer to the Supreme Court and serve warrants on behalf of the Supreme Court. That makes sense. Okay. The Department of the Treasury, why do they have a 300-person police force with the SWAT team? The Department of Education, why do they have a police force with militarized components? These things should just be outright abolished. They don't need to be there at all. Most federal agencies don't have the constitutional authority to exist as they do anyways, never mind the moral authority. So giving them the ability to exercise a monopoly on force through policing power is just wildly inappropriate, and I don't believe the federal government should be involved in it at all. Even with the establishment of the FBI, the original intent of the FBI was mostly financial crimes investigation and major crimes to lend a supporting role to state police forces in investigation, not to take over and be what they've become.
Yeah, and they've as you said, they've sort of taken over a lot of stuff. The DEA has also taken over a lot of authority to where local police, and this is something that could be addressed at the federal level, the equitable sharing that temporarily went away during the Obama administration and then came back with Jeff Sessions as secretary of whatever it was. It wasn't Sessions. Whoever the head of the Justice Department was a few years ago undid the, the temporary repeal of equitable sharing, where local police, let's take, for instance, the Keene Police Department in Western New Hampshire.
Everyone's favorite.
Where they go into shop called Fat Stuff, and they take all of the glass pipes off of the counters, and they take everything else out of the store. And lo and behold, wouldn't you know, there was a couple of DEA agents there. And it was that day back in, I think, 2013, 2014, when there was this nationwide sweep against the synthetic cannabis. And that stuff was one of the places that got raided. And because there was a DEA agent present, they were able to do the equitable sharing where they didn't need a criminal conviction to wind up seizing all of the property for the family that owned the shop, which meant not only did they take all of the inventory out of the shop, they took the house, they took the car, they took the truck, they took everything. And then the court case was United States of America v. whatever year Ford F-350. Or I think it was a 350, but whatever the make and model of the truck was, United States of America v. whatever amount of money. And then the owners had to file an appeal to say, that's my stuff, and it wasn't used in anything illegal. So basically, in order to get their stuff back, they have to admit, I'm guilty, but now I'll prove to you that I'm not guilty.
I mean, that's one of the more egregious and blatant and in the open violations of what federal and state police officials do in conjunction. One of the more overlooked ones it happens every summer right here in New Hampshire in Woodstock with the Border Patrol checkpoints.
Yep.
Border Patrol sets up a checkpoint 98 miles away from the border in Woodstock, New Hampshire, and they stop every single car that goes through on vague suspicion. They pull people aside with no reason whatsoever. I was literally told the words, "You don't have constitutional rights here," and then had a court case thrown at me to tell me I don't have constitutional rights there. Well, they searched my car with a dog.
Yeah.
And I was sitting there curious, why are they searching with a dog? That doesn't make sense. The New Hampshire Supreme Court ruled that you can't use dogs to search for drugs, and Border Patrol doesn't have any jurisdiction over drug crime domestically. So even if I had drugs on me, Border Patrol wouldn't be able to do anything about it. And then I looked over and oh, that's a New Hampshire state trooper and a Woodstock police officer sitting right there waiting to take anybody that Border Patrol finds with drugs, because the New Hampshire state trooper and Woodstock police officer don't have justification for a warrantless stop of 500 vehicles to search them.
Yeah. And Woodstock's actually a lot closer to the border than 98 miles.
Was it? I remember.
The southern part of the state is... Well, actually, all of New Hampshire.
We were 98 miles by the road, because I ended up getting in a screaming match with the Border Patrol officer, and it was his words were like, "We're at 98 miles. That's legal."
No, it's less than 98, but yeah, probably if you follow 93 all the way up, it's 98 more miles. But if you draw a straight line, it's less than that.
Regardless, we weren't on the border.
Hampshire, I know. All of New Hampshire is within that border zone. And I even discussed this briefly with Dr. Jorgensen last week about moving the border zone down to 0 miles, where I know that the ACLU and a couple other organizations are pushing for 25.
Yeah, my argument is, if I were to accept the need for Border Patrol, and if I were to accept the need for what they're doing and how they do it, I could justify 500 feet in each direction of the border for facilities. That's about it. The border in South Korea, the most heavily militarized border in the world, the most heavily landmined strip of Earth on the planet, the actual border crossing has 500 feet of facilities on either side.
Yeah, I don't even think that the facility in Derby Line, Vermont is within 500 feet of the crossing, because you actually have to walk up the street a little ways and then go into the facility and tell them, I just came back from Canada.
Which is damn tedious. I drove out to the seacoast to meet my mother this morning for lunch, and we crossed over into Kittery, Maine to get some food. That should be as hard as it is for me to go to Montreal. in all reality. It shouldn't be any harder for me to go from New Hampshire to Montreal than it is for me to go to New Hampshire to Maine. There are neighbors, we live right there. We're similar culture, not a different language in this particular case with Montreal. But the reality is sometimes I just want to drive up and see a Bruins game. I want to go see the Bruins play in Montreal. I've already spent enough money on that. Now you're telling me I need to wait in 4 hours at Border Patrol and have my passport ready just to justify a day trip?
Yeah.
To go to another place where people of the same species as me live?
Yeah.
So.
And I'm kind of glad you mentioned Montreal because, as you know, it's in Quebec, and Quebec is in Canada. And Canada is one of those countries that has legalized weed.
The only place the only place on the New Hampshire border that hasn't legalized weed is New Hampshire. We have Massachusetts, Maine, Vermont, and Quebec have all legalized marijuana.
The one difference between Quebec and the rest of our neighbors is that Quebecers cannot grow their own cannabis, whereas most of Canada can, but it's one of those things set up, province by province. And the one difference between Vermont and the rest of our neighbors is retail purchase of cannabis is not legal.
Right, retail purchase, whatever.
Yeah,
there's existing vendors. You don't need to set up new vendors. Right, you just need to stop punishing the existing ones.
Right, and that's one of the things of when you're punishing the people that are providing the good that is not illegal to possess. Right. Like that's messed up. But it also goes to show that, and I know that in Massachusetts and Maine, there were people that were selling T-shirts for $350, and with free the weed. T-shirt, you would get a free ounce of weed because you were allowed to gift up to an ounce, and this was during the amount of time that it took them to set up the retail regulations. Which I am curious why they need new regulations when all of the states already had pre-existing therapeutic cannabis.
One of the biggest injustices in Massachusetts is marijuana law. And it's something that kind of takes me off to a fundamental principle. Massachusetts marijuana law requires anybody who works at a recreational dispensary to pass a state-run background check.
Yes.
That excludes anybody who's been convicted of a felony. And if you've ever been convicted of a felony in Massachusetts, you can't work at a dispensary. And one of the felonies that they're using to exclude people is possession with intent to distribute of marijuana.
Yeah.
Personally, I don't smoke weed, but if I wanted to go to a dispensary, I'd love to have the guy who spent 20 years of his life in prison for a victimless crime and knows what he's talking about clearly helping me shop for my weed.
Yeah, and in other states, anybody that has ever had a drug conviction is prohibited from, regardless of the misdemeanor or felony, just if you had a drug conviction. But,
talk about piling on the harm.
We can drive less than an hour to dispensaries in Massachusetts. Mm-hmm. We're legally allowed to have up to 3/4 of an ounce. We're not legally allowed to have it. It's a violation level offense until the third one, and then it's a misdemeanor. So, you can kind of maybe have it if you don't get caught, which is kind of how everything is. You could have 1 million pounds of cocaine as long as you don't get caught with it.
Right.
But under federal law, it's still illegal to drive across the border with cannabis, even if you're a medical patient.
Yep. The dispensaries in Maine have started including literature in their bags reminding people it's illegal to go to New Hampshire.
So as a senator, if you were to get elected, I know that there was something that was proposed, I forget if it was this session or last session, called the States Act, where states was an acronym about something, that would essentially do a federalization of cannabis laws, but decriminalize at the federal level, but still keep in the penalties about crossing borders with it. And then it would make it a federal crime to violate a state cannabis law.
If I recall correctly, as insane as it is, the only reason marijuana is illegal in the first place is because somebody argued the interstate commerce clause. Somebody argued that growing your own marijuana violated interstate, was a threat to interstate commerce. The reality is that the federal government shouldn't have any role in regulating this whatsoever.
Yeah.
It should really come down to, you know what? Alabama is gonna Alabama. Alabama does not want any marijuana in Alabama. If they have a state law that prohibits driving marijuana through Alabama, so be it. But if it's legal in 2 adjoining states that have no problem with it, why is the federal government involved at all? That's the bigger question we need to ask. Why is the federal government interfering with voluntary interaction and transaction across state lines at all? And that's something I would want to address and change as a senator, is getting the United States federal government out of its meddling mode and leaving the states to dictate their own best practices and best policies.
So you've got me thinking about something. Let's say, for instance, and not that I think this is going to happen anytime soon, but let's say, for instance, no, you know what? Let's take the for instance out of it. Let's use a real life human example, as opposed to, I guess, a chipmunk example. I'm not sure. But Maine and Massachusetts both have, as we already mentioned, legal to grow, possess, distribute. Well, you can distribute as long as you've jumped through hoops and hurdles. But, retail purchase, legal. So let's say that I'm in Massachusetts.
Yep.
And I'm going to Maine.
You have to go through New Hampshire.
Drive through about 20 miles of New Hampshire.
Right.
Is there a way, hold on, is there a way to have some sort of federal, I don't know if interdiction is the right term, but
federal protection.
Yeah, a protection of, if the place that you're coming from has said that it's okay for you to have it, and the place that you're going to has said that it's okay that you have it, as long as you're not, like openly using it between those 2 places, whatever state you pass through can't charge you.
Right. So there's a framework for exactly that exists in other prohibited things on state levels, specifically with guns. Now, to address it, we would first need to at least decriminalize on a federal level before we could address anything involving the drugs.
Right.
But the Firearm Owners Protection Act, FOPA, allows somebody who is licensed or legally able to possess and carry a firearm in the jurisdiction they are leaving and the jurisdiction they are traveling to pass through any state jurisdiction in which they are unlicensed or unlegally able to carry a weapon,
which
such
is how
as
everybody
New York or DC.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's how everybody from New England is able to visit the rest of the country with their guns, driving through the vampire state.
Right. Well, believe it or not, New York is not all that gun unfriendly if you just go through the northern part. But
that adds 5 hours to your trip.
Well, but it saves you $60 in tolls too. But no, something along the frameworks of FOPA, where as long as you don't make any major stops, no overnight stops, and no utilization of it, and it needs to be locked in your trunk, unaccessible during the time you're in a jurisdiction you're unable to possess it in, then it can't be held against you. The problem is the enforcement of FOPA. Even FOPA, which is federal law to protect firearm owners, to do specifically this, several states have decided they don't give a shit and are prosecuting people anyways. Notably, New York City is prosecuting people on a local county level. When they catch people at the airport who are traveling with guns, they will arrest them on the spot and charge them in New York City. There was a case in, I believe it was New Jersey. It was New Jersey and Pennsylvania, where a woman from Pennsylvania was day tripping into New Jersey to pick someone up and go back to Pennsylvania. And she had her children in her van, and she had her perfectly legal handgun from Pennsylvania that she was licensed to carry in Pennsylvania, and got pulled over in New Jersey, and it got, I believe, a 7-year sentence for possessing it in New Jersey.
That's absolutely ridiculous, but it also opens up the question of what about people from Vermont, where they have never had such a thing as a concealed carry permit.
So that's the beautiful thing about FOPA. FOPA has nothing to do with licensing and permitting. It has to do with availability, and legality to possess. So people from Vermont were historically screwed until other states started passing constitutional carry.
Like New Hampshire.
Right. Or even New York. Believe it or not, you don't need a license to possess a long gun or a rifle in New York. Only handguns and any other weapons. Right. And in New York City, nobody's allowed to possess anything because that's a draconian hellhole. But people from Vermont were always able to pass through upstate New York, no problem, because you didn't need a license to have your long gun in New York, and you never have. It's a really weird and unique place.
Yeah. I just know that when constitutional carry, or rather the thing they call constitutional carry, because there are still places that you're prohibited from constitutionally carrying. So, the thing they call constitutional carry, when it was working its way through the New Hampshire legislature, a lot of the people testifying in support of the bill were actually Vermonters that lived in border towns, that were saying, like, the nearest grocery store to me is across the river in New Hampshire. I have to unload my firearm when I'm about to cross the bridge, because I'm allowed to carry, without a permit where I live, because there's no such thing as a permit, but I need a permit to carry a loaded weapon in New Hampshire concealed. But I don't want to pay the $100, non-resident registration fee.
And I think it's funny that you call it what's so-called constitutional carry. In reality, I think Vermont might be the only state that can call its constitutional carry provisions constitutional carry, because they never actually had a law passed. It was just courts interpreting the Constitution. Every other state passed a law.
There's also, various places, some government properties where you're just not allowed to, what's the
post office?
No, I'm trying to pull up the wording here for the New Hampshire. It's Part 1, Article 2A, as in the number 2-A, not Second Amendment. All persons have the right to keep and bear arms in defense of themselves, their families, their property, and the state. But there are parts of the state where I'm not allowed to defend myself or the state.
Right.
Campuses, courthouses,
post offices,
any federal property, technically.
I think one of the funniest restrictions even still left on the books in New Hampshire, because they tried to repeal it the past couple of years and it just didn't work, was in a state park on an ATV. In a state park is fine. On an ATV is fine. In a state park on an ATV is not fine.
Yeah, I thought you were going to go with the collecting seaweed and rockweed at night below the high tide line, or the prohibition on metallic knuckles that you can only lawfully possess if you have a hunting or fishing license and are in the act of going to or coming from hunting or fishing, or in the act of hunting or fishing.
So
I don't know why you need brass knuckles to go fishing.
You ever accidentally hooked a shark?
No, I have not.
I have. I could have.
That's when you just cut the line and you don't worry about getting it close enough to punch out with brass knuckles.
Yeah, so I mean, I could theorize why you may need brass knuckles, because let's say you're fishing in Massachusetts, where you're not allowed to have your shotgun on the boat, and you're fishing for tuna, so you use thick wire gauge line that can't be cut, and you hook a shark.
Okay. All right.
But just don't fish in Massachusetts. That's the moral of the story.
Yeah. So are there any things, we've got about 20 minutes left. I will jump over into the Facebook, I think, and see if I can pull some questions. But are there any specific things that you're planning to do over the next just under 90 days between now and the election? What's your campaigning look like?
So again, we just started last week our own little video conference, quote unquote podcast series for the campaign, where I'm inviting other candidates, other non-candidates, people just talk about certain kind of key points of libertarian philosophy at state, local, and federal levels, and what libertarian philosophy can do. And really leaning on the Jorgensen campaign to kind of tell us what they're planning on doing, because I see my role as a statewide candidate as a proxy for the Jorgensen campaign, as well as campaigning for myself. And that's something we really need to start coordinating. And we are investigating, my team's investigating what we can do to start kind of holding our own events. Respect social distancing guidelines, make things as safe as possible, but make them happen. Get people back out, get people back engaging with each other, because I see this as not just an opportunity to campaign, but if we can start proving that things can start happening safely again, that we can start having events with a large or even a moderate or a modest group of people engaging, that the social benefit for everyone involved is going to be huge for morale of everyone involved as well. And that's something that I see we're drastically needing. And we can see being cooped up for so long as part of this pandemic, even in our small community here in Manchester, New Hampshire, we've seen things kind of very high tension, and everyone's very high strung, and no one is really had a chance to vent and get things out. And I think using the campaign as an opportunity and as an excuse to kind of break down the barriers the state's put in the way of what we're doing, even if the state's not going to allow it, even if it's illegal, if we can make sure that we're doing it safely, I want to do it. And we want to get people out and get people involved. Obviously, door knocking's not the best idea this year. That's not something we're really even looking at as a possibility. Knocking on strangers' doors and asking them to talk to you in a pandemic, no. But maybe encouraging people to grab the mask they don't want to wear, come out to a barbecue with a bunch of other people, social distance, and have a good time at Bearbrook Street Park, if we can get the state to agree to let us do it. Maybe that's something we can do. Maybe start hosting more protest rallies, because the state can't stop a protest. And those are things that we can kind of drive, that we can get people back out, we can get people back engaged, we can remind people that politics are so important in New Hampshire, because we are first, and we're not just first in the nation for the primary, we're first in the nation for involvement. That your average New Hampshire citizen is more involved in politics than anywhere else in the country, because this is a place where you just get used to senators and congressmen showing up at the diner in the middle of January to have a conversation with you over breakfast. And this is a place where your state reps and state senators are so accountable to their communities and their neighborhoods that you recognize them on the side of the street and you can yell at them when they do something you don't like. And I've done it. I've driven to Concord to yell at them, but I've also seen them walking their dogs in West Manchester and yelled at them. Yeah. Those are things that are unique to the New Hampshire experience, but the key thing is it's getting out. And New Hampshire is a beautiful state. We don't necessarily have to do all of this stuff in the cities. There are parts of the state that are often ignored by politicians. The North Country, Coos County in its entirety, the White Mountains are beautiful, and there's tons of venues and stuff up there that we could do open air events in a public space that could be done safely. And we are really taking a hard look at seeing what we're going to be allowed to do and what kind of boundaries we can push to make things happen.
And I realize that, we're both in ballot access races.
Right.
New Hampshire is one of those states where presidential, and there's actually, about a dozen states where president just plays absolutely no role in ballot access at all. But there's, this belief, and I get really tired of hearing it. There's this belief that, if the presidential candidate gets 5%, then that guarantees us ballot access for the next 4 years. No, what it does is it guarantees the next presidential candidate will have access to some
funding.
Huge chunk of federal funding, unless Congress repeals it. And
It's not unless
there's no
Congress repeals
guarantee
it.
that
There's not much. It's not going to be strictly down to whether or not Congress repeals it. That reserve fund that was put aside for federal shared funding of presidential campaigns has been dwindling. People don't check off the box on their tax returns anymore, and the ones that do, there's last I read, there was only like $2 million left in that account.
Yeah,
and
but there's so many strings attached to that money.
That too.
The Republicans and Democrats don't even take that money anymore. Congress a few years ago got rid of the federal funding of major party conventions, which is something that, in previous years would have been tied to that 5%.
Yep.
But if you look at what happened to the Reform Party in the year 2000, after Ross Perot got over 5% in 1996, they just had all of these personalities that jumped in. Donald Trump, Jesse Ventura, Pat Buchanan.
Right.
Most people forget that Trump was, briefly in the Reform Party 2000 race.
If you look up some of Trump's speeches and some of the stuff he said when he was in that race, he was phenomenal, almost libertarian, and it blows my mind.
Completely opposite of how he is now.
Right.
But there was actually a federal court case to decide who was the actual Reform Party nominee and which committee was the actual Reform Party committee, because after Pat Buchanan got the nomination, the John Hagelin supporters walked out, had their own rump convention, called themselves the Reform Party, and so they were fighting for these, tens of millions of dollars. And I'm afraid that the same thing would happen with the Libertarian Party, unless, in 2 years, we're able to amend the bylaws to prohibit our presidential candidate from accessing those funds. But, that's a completely different fight. And that there are actually a lot of people in the party that I've spoken with that are adamant that we should take all of the federal funds that are available because reasons.
No, I'm not necessarily against taking all of the federal funds available for our presidential candidate. But again, it comes with restrictions, and the candidate and their campaign need to be okay with those restrictions. And it comes with smaller donation limits. A lot of people, you need to raise $5,000 from at least 100 different people in each of 20 different funds. That's the
matching funds. That's completely different from just the federal handout that is given if you get over 5% and you ask for the handout.
I believe the handout is gone. I believe that fund is depleted. It's not gone legally. I believe the fund is depleted.
Oh, the fund might be depleted, but it legally still exists.
Right. So, because I believe it was actually Lincoln Chafee tried to get that when he ran in the Democratic primary, and there was nothing left to give him.
That would have been matching funds.
No, he got the matching funds.
Okay. Well, he wasn't the nominee, so the funding for getting
it was
getting over 5%.
There was a handout for primary candidates as well, and he was straight up denied, saying there was no money. But then he got the matching funds instead. They came with different sets of restrictions. Okay. I know Vermin. The matching funds are actually available for us. Libertarian candidates have the matching funds available, not the big handout. Nobody's come close to qualifying. Vermin Supreme actually put in an effort to try and get it this time.
Yeah. The last Libertarian candidate that actually received matching funds was Gary Johnson in 2012. And then about a year later, it came out that his filing was off by an order of 10x, and that he actually had a much larger deficit than what he had reported. And so he had some really huge fine to pay to the FEC. So at some point, the Johnson 2016 campaign the Johnson 2012 campaign wrote a letter to the FEC asking, does it matter who pays this? And the response was, we don't care as long as we get our money. Right. So Johnson 2016 paid a lawyer for some kind of something that was to the penny what the fine was, and then the lawyer paid the fine to the FEC. But Johnson swore up and down. Johnson 2016 didn't pay any of the fines or deficits or anything else owed by Johnson 2012. Prior to that, Harry Brown, I forget if it was in 96 or 2000, had qualified for the matching funds just so that he could publicly reject them. Like, he made an effort to qualify so that he could publicly reject them on principle.
Well, I mean, that's a Harry Brown thing to do.
And I know that there are, some states where they have the, I think they call it the Clean Money Act in Arizona, where, again, if you, sign away that I promise that I won't raise this, that, the other thing, please give me government money.
So it was weird. I don't know much about the Arizona one specifically, but in talking to, I can't remember what candidate, it was a Libertarian candidate that was chasing that fund. The way it worked was they had to have registered voters go on the state treasury website, and there was a portal where they had to log in with their tax information and specifically request that $5 or $10 of their tax money be allocated, of their taxes that they were paying, be allocated to the candidate. And if you got enough people to do that, the state treasury just wrote you a check for your campaign. And it was never a donation you actually received from anyone. It was a specific allocation of the taxes they were already paying. And it was really weird the way the system was explained to me. And
I know that there was something proposed in New Hampshire a couple of years ago where similar sort of thing, but instead of logging into a portal, because our Secretary of State is still stuck in 1842 and doesn't know how internet works. I think he still communicates with carrier pigeons. But the plan was to mail voters out some sort of candidate voucher dollar sort of something. They could give their vouchers to candidates that they liked, and then the candidates, once they had accumulated enough of these vouchers, could then go to the Secretary of State's office and turn in the vouchers for money. But this fund was supposed to have been voluntarily funded, and the point was to get money out of politics. And so during my testimony against the bill, I asked, if this is supposed to be voluntarily funded, why don't the sponsors just create a super PAC and give the money out the way they want to? And of course, it was a completely rhetorical question, but when I went to sit down, I could see just the dumbfoundedness over everybody's face, because they're like, oh, that's not what we meant by getting money out. We meant, all that other money. It's different when it's the government handing out the money to Republicans and Democrats. We just don't want the Koch brothers involved or something.
Yeah. So I looked up the lump sum fund. If our candidate were to receive 5%, the party would receive about $1 million.
Not the party.
No, the next
candidate.
The next candidate would receive about $1 million. If our candidate,
a whole bunch of strings attached to that.
Right. It would limit your spending to no more than was given to you. If our candidate got 15 or got 20%, they could get up to $81 million. It's proportional to the percentage you get. So unless we have a candidate that pulls a Ross Perot, gets 31% but no electoral votes, it's not really worth considering. And in 2013, they allocated the balance of the fund to pediatric research.
Yeah, and again, it would not surprise me at all if Congress just, one of these days gets around to eliminating it completely, because nobody's used it in so many years.
Right. Well, it says they do keep statistics on how many Americans actually check the box on their taxes. And in 2013 was the last year they have the stats for. It was less than 5% of Americans, where only 3 election cycles previously, it was 42% of Americans.
Yeah. So real quick, we're almost out of time here. What are like the first couple of bills that Justin O'Donnell would introduce if elected to the U.S. Senate?
The very first bill is going to be taking a page out of the book of Congresswoman Gabbard, who, even though she had a lot to say about this matter, never actually went as far as submitting a bill on it, where by an act of Congress to pull back all U.S. troops from overseas. Because we've had presidential candidates campaigning on doing it for so long that they've never following through. The past 3 presidential candidates that were elected were all the anti-war candidate and who proceeded to start wars. So I have no faith in the office of the presidency ever following through on that. I believe it will take an act of Congress to do so, to remind the president that without a declaration of war from Congress, they can't keep doing this, and to stop all funding for it. Because furthermore, I had a discussion on a big long rant on video a couple weeks ago. Every major issue we want to address, I believe, is tied to the ongoing war. Every major issue that I, as a candidate, I as a senator, and I as a libertarian, or I as a voter want to see addressed can be tied to our foreign policy, because foreign policy is domestic policy. If I'm not even necessarily saying we need to stop government spending overnight on everything, because if we weren't spending trillions of dollars blowing up the Middle East and bombing weddings and creating division and sowing hate and fear all over the world, that's money that maybe could be allocated to developing infrastructure, rebuilding our local economies, providing job training for people whose jobs are being destroyed by a changing and evolving economy, to help them get back into the private sector, without raising a tax burden or even lowering a tax burden, because we're no longer at war, to encourage market innovation, because we're no longer at war. A large part of the heroin and fentanyl crisis that we're having in the United States right now, that's spurning support for the war on drugs and the over-militarization of our police, comes back to the fact that the chief export of Afghanistan is heroin. And prior to our invasion of Afghanistan, heroin was illegal, and growing it was punishable by death. We can have a whole nother discussion about the morality of doing that and how there was a tyrannical government in Afghanistan, but it wasn't our place to go stop that as the United States government. And what we did was we created another global crisis with the heroin epidemic. So all of these things come back to our involvement in global war, the United States military adventurism having unforeseen consequences here at home. And I believe before we can address anything else, we need to address that.
Yeah, and something else that could be addressed with the nearly $1 trillion a year that's not being spent blowing stuff up. Let's also look at, some amount of money that is no longer going to Raytheon and Boeing to make things that only go boom. And we could use some of that money to solve the homeless problem, not just homeless vets, which is also a problem.
But there are so many ways to address the homeless problem that people don't want to think of. I believe the actual way to address the homeless problem is on the most local level possible. Individual cities and towns doing what they can to get people off of the streets. It's not a federal issue. The consequences of the homeless crisis are a federal issue. Right. The root problems that are causing homelessness are the most local issues possible. We have a absolutely massive problem in New Hampshire. We are going to see a skyrocketing homeless population in the next few years, because we have a less than 1% rental vacancy rate in the major cities in New Hampshire. We don't have a growing economy because of this economic crisis we've had right now. And we have more people immigrating in than emigrating out. We have a housing shortage in New Hampshire. We are going to have more people than we have jobs or homes, and that's due to zoning laws. And that's the most local level thing that's possible. That's something that's decided by 5 people elected from your neighborhood that are prohibiting construction because they don't like the ugly buildings. It's not luxury apartments going in, that we can't have affordable housing going in. even though that would create thousands of jobs in the construction industry and the service industry, and it would provide housing and low income and affordable housing for the tens of thousands of homeless people that are already there. But that's not the only way to address it either. I saw an incredibly interesting proposal a while back that somebody had pitched for the city of Detroit. The city of Detroit has more abandoned property than it does homeless people. There are more standing abandoned homes in Detroit with no occupant than there are homeless people in Detroit. I know one of the fundamental tenets of libertarianism is a respect for private property. This property is abandoned. Nobody's maintaining it. Nobody's upkeeping it. Nobody's claiming it. Nobody's paying the property taxes on it. I hate property taxes as an indicator of ownership, but the fact is, people have straight up abandoned their claim to this property. Right. I believe it's incumbent on the city to take that property and sell it off, and not to sell it off for a profit, but to sell it off for $1 per home, on the condition that the people who buy it put the minimum amount of effort into it to create affordable housing. And that's how you get people off the streets, because now you're going to have hundreds of thousands of man hours needed for renovation work. And that's good paying work. And an industrial city like Detroit, where you have auto workers and high skilled laborers who are laid off due to automation and outsourcing, and you get those people back to work, you have affordable housing to get people off the streets. You clean up Detroit, you solve the homeless problem in Detroit, and then you're a beacon and a shining example to the world of what the worst can become the best. And it's a simple fix.
We're at 7 o'clock right now, but conversation's going good. Do you still have a few more minutes, or do you?
Absolutely. I don't have anything until 7:30.
All right, excellent. One thing that you mentioned is, it ultimately is a local problem, the homeless situation. But what we're seeing in Manchester specifically is a mayor and a board of aldermen, that's city council for those of you that have never heard of aldermen before, which would include me until a few years ago. We have this group of people that they don't want to find a way to, hey, let's help these people that are down on their luck, or have this substance abuse disorder because they have no house to sleep in. They want them to go away.
They'll bulldoze the camps and put people on a bus to Concord, make it their problem.
Yeah. Meanwhile, Concord's sending people to Manchester.
Make it our problem.
When they, took away the porta-johns and the temporary water stuff to where people could wash their hands. When they took that away, the mayor said, well, we hope that everybody goes to the shelter that was already close to capacity.
Right.
There are a lot of people that don't like going to the shelter because the shelter has a lot of really strict rules. So for one, if you're not there by like 6 or 7 o'clock at night, you don't get a bed. If you have any beer, not an open beer that you're drinking while you're there, but if you happen to have a beer or other alcoholic beverage in your bag, you get kicked out. If you fraternize with other occupants, you get kicked out. Fraternizing in more than just, chit-chatting. And I actually know a guy that got kicked out for fooling around with another occupant of the homeless shelter. 90-day ban. So where can you go when you're kicked out of the homeless shelter in the city? Right. You go back to the street. And then just before the election last year, the mayor and city council said, we're going to enforce the curfew in the parks from 11 p.m. to 7 in the morning. Oh, yeah, and we're also going to prevent people from loitering during the day. What are you supposed to do in a park? I thought parks were where you could go and just hang out.
Loiter, sunbathe in the sun, enjoy the nice day.
Yeah, apparently you can be shooed away for loitering in the park, which then creates chronic fatigue on top of stress of not having a home, on top of the stress of your stuff always being stolen, sometimes by the cops, sometimes by other people, stuff getting thrown away. And yeah, is it any wonder that people turn to substances? Like there are people that live in, and Jackie has said this so many times, it's just ingrained in my brain. There are people that live in these luxury upscale apartments 2 blocks away from where I live that they've spent thousands of dollars on a mattress. They've got their, climate controlled bedroom system. They've got these, $100 sheets. They still take sleeping pills. They still wash it down with a glass of wine. And when they wake up in the morning, they still take large amounts of caffeine. But they look down on everybody else as druggies because those drugs are illegal. And, this is something that, and I'm thinking of trying to formulate this into either a letter to the editor or an op-ed about predictive policing and how it does need to be completely abolished because it's essentially pre-crime.
Statistical models don't even have a place in baseball. They've ruined that game. Never mind policing.
And, there are a lot of data scientists that had previously worked on the predictive policing that, they're now saying we're not working on this anymore because we realize that the results of this could appear racist. The large newspaper in the state recently had an editorial saying that statistics aren't racist. You should trust the computers. Well, if you put something into the statistics or into the computer to point out that everybody in this neighborhood right over here is a criminal, so cops, you need to have a higher presence over in this specific neighborhood that just so happens to have an overly, be overly represented by the minority populations, then when the cops go over there, they're going to be looking for a lot of crime and they're going to find it.
Right.
Whereas if we sent the cops over to is it the east side that is one of the upscale neighborhoods?
The North End.
What was that?
The North End.
Yeah, if we sent them into one of the upscale neighborhoods,
yep,
but also told them, our computer said that there's a lot of crime happening here, they would find it. They would find those underground poker games. They would find the illegal betting on sports. They would find, whatever else is going on, maybe a little bit of the nose candy. They would find the crime. If you're looking for the crime in a specific area, you will find it. But the people that live in the upscale neighborhood, they've got more money for lawyers.
Right.
We're not going to get a conviction when we go after the people in the upscale neighborhood because they've got money for good lawyers. We'll get a lot of convictions if we go over to the low-income neighborhood.
Well, how much of the predictive modeling actually takes that into account? How much of the predictive modeling that they're doing is not just looking at arrest rates, but actual conviction rates, which they'll term a good arrest when it turns into a conviction?
Right. Even if it's something the person didn't actually do, and there's a lot of people that plead guilty to crimes they didn't do.
Because they can't afford a lawyer to get them out of it.
They can't afford a lawyer to get them out of it, and even if they can afford a lawyer, the lawyer will tell them, all right, so there's a 50-50 shot that if you go to trial, you'll be found not guilty. And if you go to trial and you're found guilty, that maximum penalty that they're talking about, that's what you'll do. But if you just sign right here, sentence suspended, you get to go home today by saying I'm guilty.
Right.
Okay. It's upside down world where if you say I'm guilty, you go home. If you say I'm not guilty, you go to jail. I don't want to say it's out of Kafka's The Trial, but it's very damn close.
Right, and a lot of it's happening to younger kids too. Like, I don't mean a kid like 12, 13 years old, like 17 to 25-year-olds who really don't have a grasp on how that conviction is going to affect their future.
Yeah, and now in New Hampshire, unfortunately, you still have to check that little box saying I've been convicted of a crime. Oh, you've got a conviction on your record? Well, you know what? I'm sorry, Mr. O'Donnell, but we've had 75 other people also apply for this apartment, and they don't come with that baggage.
Right. And
So, like there's a lot of these things, and that is something else that feeds into the homeless situation. So anybody with a conviction on their record goes to the back of the line, and the line keeps getting longer every day. Anybody with any sort of break in a rental history, for whatever reason, back of the line. Anybody with an eviction, back of the line. And, it's all of this stuff just keeps piling up. You can't get a good job because you've been convicted. Now you can't get an apartment because you have no job because you've been, convicted. Right. You also can't get the apartment because you've been convicted. What else are you supposed to do but go find things in the black market that are going to lead to more convictions?
Well, black market is the best market if only it weren't for the convictions.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Any final thoughts here, Justin? And then we can just go ahead and wrap it up.
I mean, final thought, just to pitch in a plea to everybody, for both myself and Darryl. Look at our campaigns. Look at who we're running against. I'm running against Gene Shaheen. Darryl's running against Chris Sununu, two of the longest-serving political dynasties in New Hampshire. You deserve to be represented by people you know. You deserve to be represented by people who live in your communities. You deserve to be represented by people who understand the struggles of daily living in New Hampshire. You don't deserve to be represented by somebody who's so disconnected from everyday life that they were groomed and bred for the position by their parents and their grandparents and their cousins and brothers, all of whom serve in high government offices. That's not what New Hampshire is supposed to be about. We're born with a legacy of live, free, or die. That's not just a New Hampshire motto. That should be an American motto. It should be a human motto. We should live, free, or die. We should not be bound by the rules of masters and dynasties. We don't have a kingship. We don't have a royal family. Yet why do we keep electing them? We keep voting for more of the same and wondering why things get worse. Now is the chance to make a difference. Now is the libertarian year. Now is the libertarian moment. We need to grasp it by the ballot box. We need to take it and send a message to the political dynasties. Send it to this DC. Send it to Concord. Put people packing. Tell them that we're tired of living by their rules and living by their whims. That it's time for the people to stand up, and it's time for the people to be represented, and it's time for you to realize that you are the people.
Justin, thank you very much for coming on. I definitely want to have you on at least one more time between
absolutely
September and late October. So, we've got basically 2 months to get you booked. We've got a month to figure it out. What's the website?
Website's going to be O'Donnell2020.com, ODONNELL, 2 N's, 2 L's, 2020.com. And when you visit, there are 2 big gold buttons right on the front page: donate, volunteer. If you can do both, do both. If you can do one, do one. We're going to need everybody on board. We're going to need everybody, boots on the ground. Like I said, we're going to find a way to make this work. We're going to find a way to put people in the streets. We're going to find a way to send the message to Concord and send the message to DC that it's time for a new pace.
Justin, again, thank you. And if you're watching and you want to help my campaign, the website is darrylwperry.com. Also, you should send a text. Text the word Perry to 77948. Text Perry to 77948. darrylwperry.com is the website. Just ordered the first billboard, getting some rates on ad packages for radio, TV, looking into newspaper, because again, the traditional sort of retail politics, it's not possible. And I still need to get the message out to voters. Me and Justin both need to get 4%. Actually, one or the other, but it would be great if it's both, because that would save us over $10,000 total combined is what the party wound up spending. Hundreds, if not thousands, of volunteer hours just to get on the ballot. And then
All
untold
in?
hours of city and town
Yep.
clerks and supervisors of the checklist getting confused and trying to figure out what's this form that I've never seen before that says petition of nomination.
I had one town clerk yesterday act confused, like she'd never seen it before, said she couldn't do it. I threatened to call the Secretary of State, and she magically knew how to do it.
Yeah. And then I think you also said that there was I forget if it was you or Zachary that said that there was one of the clerks wanted to leave before 4 o'clock.
Yeah.
But got told, no, there's actually a state law that says that on days that political filings happen, you are required to be open from 3 to 5 p.m.
Yep.
It's just like, well, can you tell me the RSA number?
Yep. And I didn't have it off the top of my head. That's why I had to text you. I'm like, what the hell's the RSA? Like,
yeah, and if I hadn't have looked it up the day prior,
yeah.
it would have taken me 5 minutes instead of 2 to
Right.
get that pulled up for you. But yeah, there's a lot of laws that need to be changed, especially as it relates to ballot access. I would love to adopt the Vermont method of as long as you're organized,
Right.
you're on the ballot.
And it's a pretty loose definition of organized.
You have a
10
town
town
committee
committees.
in 10 towns.
Right.
10 towns. We've got, what is it,
232 towns in 13 cities.
Yeah, 244 chances, 245, something like that.
Right.
Yeah, we can get 10 of those. We can get 10 of those. Or the Mississippi model of you're organized, meaning you've got some bylaws, you've got a chair, a secretary, and either a vice chair or a treasurer. As long as you've got 3 officers and some bylaws and you send those to the state, you're on the ballot.
Yep.
But of course, our senile old Secretary of State is convinced that if any of the election laws change, we can't have the first in the nation primary anymore. I'm sorry. Why should taxpayers pay for primaries?
They shouldn't.
If the Republicans and the Democrats want to have a primary in New Hampshire before they have a primary anywhere else, let them pay for it. We pay for our own conventions. Let them pay for their primaries. Justin, again, thanks for being on. Went little over the hour, which is something that we don't normally do. But thank you, everybody, for watching. This will go up on the YouTube later, darrylwperry.com/YouTube. And again, darrylwperry.com is the website. Thank you. Have a good night. I'll see you next week.
See you.